Imagine just scrolling through your social media feed, and with every single sentence you read, you are legally and spiritually signing a binding contract.
Right, without even knowing it.
Exactly. A contract that fundamentally rewrites your physical reality. Like you don't get a notification, you don't click, I agree on some pop-up.
Oh, that would be terrifying.
Just by letting your eyes track across a paragraph, you are tethering your soul to the ideas on that screen. I mean, you would probably throw your phone across the room.
Yeah, and sheer terror, absolutely.
But according to the stack of texts we are diving into today, you are already doing exactly that.
Which is such a wild concept.
It really is. We are jumping into a fascinating universe today where stories, texts, and archives do so much more than simply record history. They actively engineer reality.
And it's an incredibly rich premise,
Yeah.
you know? We are looking at a world that takes the quiet, almost invisible, really drift of ordinary media consumption and just hardens it into a physical, enforceable law of nature.
So, the mission for today's deep dive is to unpack those subtle, cumulative ways that prolonged exposure to information reshapes your baseline sense of what is normal.
Right, because it happens to all of us.
It does. And we're going to explore what happens when the people in charge of the archives realize how this mechanism works, when they start using it to engineer the public's mind.
Soulcraft, basically.
Yes, soulcraft. And most importantly, we are going to look at how you, the listener, can spot the gaps in the curated narratives you are fed every single day.
It's so relevant to how we live right now.
It really is. So let's start with the foundational rule of this universe. It pops up in a narrative called Shadow, Salt, and Betrayal.
Oh, yeah, that quote.
There was this chilling quote, right? It says, "Knowing is the first betrayal of any good secret. Reading makes you accountable. You are no longer a witness. You are a participant. You are liable."
You are liable. I mean, that phrasing completely collapses the distance we usually assume exists between the observer and the observed.
Which we rely on. We like to think we're safe.
Exactly. We like to think that when we read an article or, watch a video, we're sitting safely behind a pane of glass, just taking notes. But this text insists that the pane of glass does not exist.
I want to try to understand the mechanics of this, though, because the sources introduce this concept called chronomnesis from something called the doctrine of New Sophia.
Right, the doctrine of New Sophia.
It argues that a person is simply the residue of their repeated intentional acts. The phrase they use is, "The weaver is woven by the weaving."
Which sounds very poetic.
It does sound poetic, but how does this universe actually enforce it? Like, how does reading a ghost story turn into a physical liability?
Well, to understand the mechanics, we have to look at how the author is utilizing a real-world media studies concept.
Oh, cultivation theory, right?
Yes, cultivation theory. But they are building it into the realist backbone of their fantasy universe. Cultivation theory is this very real psychological phenomenon where prolonged exposure to media quietly reshapes your baseline sense of what the world is.
Just over time, slowly.
Exactly. And it operates entirely below the threshold where your conscious skepticism can step in and override it. Like if you watch enough local news, you will fundamentally overestimate how dangerous your neighborhood is.
Regardless of the actual crime statistic.
Right. Regardless of the facts.
Because your brain is internalizing a steady diet of anomalies until they feel like the baseline average.
Yes. And the fantasy move the text makes here is just remarkably elegant. I mean, it doesn't import some alien, arbitrary magic system to make the world work.
That doesn't need to.
Exactly. It simply takes that weak, aggregate, hard-to-isolate psychological effect of media consumption and renders it absolute. It makes it personal and binding.
Which gives this entire universe an empirical floor, doesn't it?
It really does. If a reader tries to dismiss the Codex Mysterium as pure make-believe, they are actually arguing against the quieter, real-world version that operates on them every time they open a web browser.
Wow. And the source material calls this coherent emergent realism?
Yes, that's the philosophical term for it.
The idea that objective reality is not just a static backdrop. It is shaped by the recursive loop between individuals and the informational networks they participate in.
Right. To observe a thing is to entangle with it and ultimately to shape it. Every system of thought emerges through a mind embedded in the world it seeks to know.
You cannot separate the instrument of measurement, the human mind, from the reality being measured.
You really can't.
Man, it makes my own screen time habits feel a lot more sinister. You aren't just absorbing information, you are literalizing a worldview.
Which is a heavy responsibility.
It is. Which brings us to a really uncomfortable question. If texts shape the reader's reality over time, what happens when someone starts editing those texts?
Ah, yeah, the second edition.
Right. We get to see this play out through the meticulous internal logs of an archive clerk named Mrs. Rossi.
Mrs. Rossi is such a brilliantly drawn perspective. She represents the absolute banality of cosmic engineering.
Just a clerk doing her job.
Yeah, she doesn't wield a magical staff, she wields a rubber stamp. She works in an archive that trains its clerks to notice things without reacting to them.
So she receives 2 copies of the same title, Mysterium. They look identical on the outside. But when she opens them, she realizes she is holding Edition 1 and Edition 2.
And she starts comparing them.
Right. She writes down her observations on a faintly yellowed, standard issue archive form. She notes that Edition 2 has a different organizational structure. But then she gets really specific.
The omission part.
Yes. She writes, contradictions resolved through omission, events presented as administrative outcomes rather than contested accounts.
And then that devastating final assessment.
Tone throughout is neutral. Conclusions are presented as settled.
The phrase conclusions are presented as settled is the actual mechanism of control in this universe. Editing is no longer mere curation.
It's not just censorship.
No, it's not even just censorship in the traditional informational sense. The creation of a second edition becomes a direct cultivation intervention.
Mind engineering.
Exactly. It is the active engineering of what a population of minds will become. And we see this with the senior archivist, Brother Mannix.
He confiscates the raw first editions from Rossi.
He does, and his justification is fascinating. He says, the institution requires texts that conclude. Endlessly suggestive material creates instability.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
Let's look at this from Brother Mannix's perspective. We just established that in this universe, reading dangerous material makes you liable.
It does.
You can literally bind your soul to a haunted house or draw the attention of dark entities. So if reading is a loaded weapon, isn't Mannix just putting the safety on?
That's certainly how he would frame it.
Isn't a clean, conclusive, scrubbed text a form of necessary protection for the general public?
That is the perpetual justification of every institution that seeks to control information. They frame censorship as stewardship. But we have to ask, when does stewardship cross over into soulcraft? What happens when the editor understands the mechanism of reality shaping better than the readers do?
So he's not protecting them.
Mannix isn't just protecting people from monsters, he's protecting the institution from the people. If we look closely at the logs, there is a specific element entirely excised from the canonical second edition.
The salt passages.
Yes, they call them the salt passages.
The text mentions it arriving first, settling behind the teeth.
Right. In the context of the Codex, salt represents a literal acknowledgement of debt and consent. It is the raw, messy, binding truth of the contract between reader and reality.
So it's the real stuff.
Exactly. Now consider how the human brain processes information. Media psychology tells us that perceived realism moderates impact.
But what does that mean? Perceived realism.
It means our brains handle fictional registers and realistic registers differently. We process a myth differently than a news report.
Always.
So a savvy editor who simply wanted to protect readers from dangerous liabilities could theoretically reframe those dangerous passages.
Shift them into fiction.
Right. They could shift the text from the register of historical fact into the realm of myth, allegory, or symbolism. That would defang the physical effect without erasing the cultural memory.
But Mannix doesn't reframe the salt passages. He deletes them completely.
Which is deeply diagnostic. Yeah. The fact that he removes them outright implies that those raw truths resisted any kind of reframing.
They were too potent.
Exactly. Their power did not route through perceived realism at all. They operated on a much stranger, deeper layer of human formation.
Wow.
That absence itself tells us that some content cannot be tamed by turning it into a metaphor. So, to maintain total institutional control, Mannix has to erase the salt entirely.
Because a population fed only settled conclusions loses its capacity for critical thought.
Yes, and by extension, its ability to autonomously shape reality.
So if institutional editors like Mannix are successfully erasing these raw truths, how is a regular person supposed to notice what is no longer there?
That's the big question.
That is the exact problem a rogue library clerk named Seth is trying to solve in the sources.
Oh, Seth is phenomenal.
He is. He calls himself the keeper of the spaces for overdue books.
Such a great title.
He hides in the shadows of the archive, scribbling frantic marginalia into the margins of the sanitized texts.
And he has a whole philosophy about this.
He does. He writes, "The real teaching lives in the gaps between words, between thoughts. Its true treasures aren't on the shelves, but in the spaces between."
He is obsessively cataloging absences.
Yeah. For instance, he notices when the catalog cards for missing clerks people named Pell and Vale just quietly disappear from the wooden drawers.
Seth embodies the epistemological crisis of his world, which, frankly, mirrors the crisis of our own.
How so?
Well, in real-world scientific fields, we struggle with publication bias, expectancy effects, and the impossibility of fully stepping outside the system we are trying to measure.
Right. There is rarely a clean, uncorrupted ground truth.
Exactly. There is only testimony, accumulated dissonance, and measuring instruments that are themselves compromised by the phenomena they are trying to track.
So Seth is basically a researcher.
He becomes a single-subject cultivation researcher. He is running an N=1 experiment on corrupted hardware.
Just love that framing.
Yeah.
Earlier, I might have compared him to a detective trying to see a black hole by looking for the bent light around it.
That's a good way to look at it.
But based on what you were saying, it is actually much more active than that. Seth isn't looking for the black hole itself. He's profiling the architect who built the black hole.
Yes.
He's looking at an empty space on a shelf and asking, what kind of sensor is so terrified of a specific idea that they would risk leaving such an obvious gaping hole right here?
That is a perfect distinction. Seth's notebook practice relies on what psychologists call theory of mind, but he turns it upstream.
Upstream.
Yeah, he isn't primarily analyzing the characters in the stories or the texts themselves. He is modeling the editors.
He's trying to figure out Mannix.
Exactly. He is trying to infer Mannix's intentions, constraints, and blind spots from the negative space left behind. Seth works with exactly the grade of signal his world allows. Never definitive, always mediated.
And to make sense of that mediated signal, Seth relies on a framework the sources call the ecology of meaning.
And the sheaf theoretic logic of local and global disagreement.
It is incredibly dense academic jargon, I grant you.
It really is.
And I want to make sure we ground it for everyone listening. If I am understanding it correctly, sheaf theory is basically a mathematical way of describing the classic parable of the blindfolded men touching an elephant.
Right, the old story.
One man feels the trunk and says it's a snake. Another feels the leg and says it's a tree trunk. They wildly contradict each other locally.
But sheaf theory says...
Right, sheaf theory says that if you map where their hands overlap, the texture of the skin aligns. You can prove they are touching the same coherent object, even if their individual perspectives are completely incompatible.
That is an excellent analogy. In the ecology of meaning, each perspective is one hand on the elephant. Each contradiction is a fold in the terrain.
So Seth realizes you cannot look for one absolute text.
No, you can't. A perfectly smooth text is a lie. You have to look for the resonance among the overlapping fragments. You have to tolerate the unresolved tension.
In one of his margin notes, Seth actually criticizes a text for being too perfectly orchestrated. He writes, "Real philosophical traditions typically have more loose ends, contradictions, and unresolved tensions than this highly orchestrated synthesis suggests."
Which is spot on.
If an explanation is too clean, it's a second edition.
A story that explains everything explains nothing.
Wow. This feels incredibly relevant to the listener's daily life. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with our own second editions.
Oh, everywhere. Social media feeds.
News aggregators, search results, all of them have been smoothed over by algorithms to present settled conclusions.
Completely curated.
Seth's methodology suggests that if we want to find the truth in our own curated information landscape, we have to look for the open seams. We have to spot where the record is torn but not yet sewn up.
Which naturally leads to the question of what we do once we spot those seams. Diagnosing the manipulation is only half the battle.
Right. How do we reclaim our autonomy? The sources provide a radical blueprint for this in a text called the Codex Mysterium, Book of the Sovereign Root.
Ah, the sovereign root. This is where the metaphysical architecture of the universe translates into a manifesto for personal freedom.
It gets really intense here.
It does. The text describes a historical pivot called the turning of the Great Branch. It outlines a time when the natural order inverted.
Meaning what, exactly?
Institutions, which are the branches, started demanding tribute and vital energy from individuals who are the roots. The systems that were originally built to serve human life hardened into forms that refused reflection or accountability.
The phrase they use is, every structure grows toward its seed. Every crown is carried by its root. When the upper branches forget this, they wither.
It's a powerful image.
The sovereign root is a mandate to reverse that inversion. It declares that your autonomy is woven into the grain of your being. No archive or engine can take it away. They can only obscure it.
And to help people reclaim that power, the text outlines 12 ritual keys.
The language here is epic, right? Things like the rite of quarantine and the unmasking of golems.
Very high fantasy.
But we need to translate this for the listener. How does the rite of quarantine apply to someone sitting in traffic listening to this on their commute?
Well, the cosmic language actually grounds perfectly into modern practical reality. The rite of quarantine is described in the text as sealing the self from uninvited sight.
Okay, so shielding yourself.
Yes. In our world, that is a direct mandate to set aggressive boundaries on your attention. If your attention is the currency that shapes your physical and psychological reality, the rite of quarantine is refusing to spend that currency on misaligned systems.
It's putting your phone in another room.
Exactly. It's taking intentional Sabbaths from the algorithm.
And what about the unmasking of golems? Because a golem traditionally is a creature made of clay that mindlessly follows a set of instructions placed in its mouth.
Right. Now, think about what a social media algorithm is. It is essentially a creature made of code, mindlessly executing instructions to maximize engagement.
Without any capacity to understand truth, nuance, or human well-being.
It is a modern golem. The sovereign root says this key strips opacity from systems that shape perception and demands that hidden logic becomes daylight.
Transparency.
Yes. In our daily lives, the unmasking of golems is a demand for algorithmic transparency. It is refusing to interact with black box systems that curate your reality without showing you how or why they are doing it.
I love that. You are demanding to see the messy first edition before the golem hands you the sanitized second edition.
On.
And there's a fascinating discovery in the sources that proves this isn't just metaphysical poetry. A character named Tasha uncovers a fragment of pre-Mysterium scholarship.
Yes, Tasha's discovery.
It's written in this dry, academic register, completely different from the cosmic tone of the rest of the codex.
Tasha's discovery is crucial. It acts as an in-world historical document proving that the grand institutional myths were actually just overwritten histories of ordinary people.
It strips away the magic.
Exactly. It details how early human innovators, people who achieved breakthroughs in agriculture or navigation, were gradually mythologized into gods and heroes by institutions seeking to consolidate power.
It is the mundane civilization's last coherent understanding of how texts gradually form readers before the institutions literalize that power into magic.
Which validates the core thesis of the entire deep dive.
The grand cosmic forces of the codex are just amplifications of real human social dynamics.
The pre-Mysterium fragment confirms that the magic of the codex isn't an arbitrary fantasy conceit. Before there was a magical contract of reading, there was just the mundane reality of human beings being shaped by the stories they consumed.
It tells us that institutional power is simply a story we have all agreed to read.
And because we are the readers, we have the sovereign power to put the book down.
We return power to the root. Let's take a step back and recap the journey we've been on today.
It's been quite a ride.
We started by exploring the chilling idea that the act of reading is a binding contract, how prolonged exposure to information actively reshapes your baseline reality, a concept anchored in the very real mechanics of cultivation theory.
And we examined how editors like Brother Mannix weaponize that mechanism. By erasing the raw, contradictory salt and presenting settled conclusions, they engineer compliant populations.
Populations who lose the ability to shape their own reality.
Exactly.
From there, we learned Seth's methodology for surviving in a corrupted informational landscape. We have to become detectives of the gaps.
Running an N=1 experiment on corrupted hardware.
Right. Instead of looking for a pristine absolute truth, we have to model the intentions of the curators. Embrace overlapping contradictions, and look for the seams where the narrative has been artificially smoothed over.
And finally, we unpack the sovereign root as a practical toolkit for modern life.
By setting boundaries on our attention and demanding transparency from the algorithmic golems that feed us our reality, we can remember that every massive institution is just a branch.
A branch relying on the root of our individual consent.
It is a profound reminder that your attention is the most powerful world-building tool you possess. Every article, feed, and narrative you absorb is slowly revising the architecture of your mind.
That's the real magic right there.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own today. Look around at the spaces in your own life where the narrative feels just a little too clean, a little too settled. If the act of reading is a contract that quietly revises your baseline reality, what second editions are you currently accepting as the settled truth in your own life? And what messy, contradictory salt has been hidden from you to keep you comfortable?